Pick any major city, Lagos, London, Sydney, Seoul, or Sao Paulo. Ask anyone under the age of 35 whether they believe they will ever own a home. Observe their face. It is the same expression across every city and every continent. The mainstream explanation is clean and comfortable. We didn't build enough, the population grew, supply didn't keep up, and prices rose. It is economics 101. However, that explanation is also dangerously incomplete because Tokyo built housing aggressively for 30 years and kept prices flat while London's tripled. Singapore achieved a 90% home ownership rate on a tiny island with almost no land to spare. The supply argument breaks when you look at the data. The real reason homes cost too much everywhere isn't a shortage of bricks. It is who owns the land underneath those bricks. And the system that locked ordinary people out of that ownership wasn't a policy failure. It was a policy success for the people it was designed to serve. Here is the part that should keep you up tonight. There is a mechanism running continuously since 1086 that was specifically engineered to make land appreciate in the hands of the few at the expense of the many. It has survived every revolution, every recession, and every reform movement. And it is still running right now in your country. For most of the 20th century, a house was valued by what it cost to build it, the materials, the labor, and the land beneath it. A house in 1950 in any Western country could be purchased for roughly 2 to 3 times the average annual household income. The Demographia International Housing Affordability Reports call this a median multiple of 3. 3 years of income buys a median home. That number for most of recorded history is where housing prices tended to hover. Today, Sydney sits at a median multiple of 13, Vancouver at 12, and London at 9. Hong Kong, before its recent corrections, briefly touched 23. Something broke, and the break has a specific timestamp. August 15, 1971. Richard Nixon appeared on national television and announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at a fixed rate. The Bretton Woods system collapsed overnight. Every major currency on Earth shifted to floating fiat money. Suddenly, the world was flooded with capital that needed somewhere to go, and it could no longer sit safely in a gold-backed savings account without eroding to inflation. At almost the same moment, governments across the English-speaking world began rewriting tax codes in ways that seemed minor on paper, but were catastrophic in practice. In the United States, capital gains on the sale of a primary residence became either deferred or exempt. The mortgage interest deduction expanded. In the United Kingdom, capital gains tax exemptions were written for residential property. The implicit message from every government to every citizen was this: if you put your money anywhere else, we will tax the profit. If you put your money into a house, we will not. Within a decade, middle-class families weren't just buying homes to live in. They were buying homes as a retirement strategy, as a wealth vehicle, and as a hedge against the currency erosion that fiat money made inevitable. Thomas Piketty's research, compiled across 17 countries over 2 centuries, found something striking buried in the wealth data. In every wealthy country he studied, the wealth-to-income ratio nearly doubled between 1970 and 2010. And when you break that increase apart and ask what actually drove it, it wasn't factories, financial innovations, or tech companies. It was housing, almost entirely housing, and specifically the land beneath it. Then came the second gear shift. Real estate investment trusts, or REITs, had existed in the United States since 1960, but were marginal. By the 1980s and 1990s, regulatory changes allowed them to scale. Pension funds from Oslo to Toronto began allocating capital into residential real estate trusts. Your mortgage was bundled into a security and sold to a Norwegian teacher's pension. The home you wanted to buy was now competing not just with your neighbor's budget, but with institutional capital from across the world. A house stopped being a place to raise children and became a leveraged financial instrument with a bedroom attached. The Bank for International Settlements tracks real inflation-adjusted house prices across 25 advanced economies. Their data shows that between 2000 and 2022, the average real increase across those economies was 60%. This wasn't in nominal terms, but in real purchasing power terms. The houses didn't get 60% better. The financial system attached to them got 60% more aggressive. This is the part nobody in mainstream housing discourse wants to say out loud because it implicates not corrupt elites or faceless bankers, but ordinary voters. On June 6, 1978, in California, Proposition 13 passed with 65% of the vote. On its face, Proposition 13 is sympathetic. It caps property tax increases at 2% per year, ostensibly protecting elderly homeowners on fixed incomes from being forced to sell. It sounds like protection for the vulnerable. What it actually created was one of the most potent wealth transfer mechanisms in American history and a political template that has quietly infected housing policy across every democratic country on earth. Here are the specific mechanics. A house in Palo Alto was worth $100,000 in 1978. Its owner pays property taxes assessed on that value, capped forever at 2% growth per year. 45 years later, the house sells for $3.5 million. The new buyer pays taxes on $3.5 million. The neighbor who bought in 1978 and never left, same street, same square footage, same school district, pays taxes on an assessed value of roughly $250,000. The difference in annual tax liability is approximately $30,000. Same street, same service from the government, but a different decade of arrival. Now ask yourself what that 1978 buyer's financial incentive is regarding new housing construction nearby. If new housing is built, new residents arrive. New residents bring demand for services, but they also introduce housing competition that might cool prices. The $3.5 million asset might soften. So the 1978 buyer shows up at every planning meeting. They fund every neighborhood character preservation campaign. They vote in every local election at dramatically higher rates than renters, who tend to be younger, more mobile, and less civically organized around property interests. This isn't villainous behavior. It is entirely rational self-interest operating inside a system designed to reward it. California is the case study, but the mechanism is global. The United Kingdom's Town and Country Planning Act of 1947 transferred development rights from landowners to the state. In theory, this gave the government control to direct housing supply toward public need. In practice, it gave locally elected councilors, who represent existing homeowners, veto power over new construction. Britain builds roughly 200,000 homes per year. Germany, with a similar population, builds 300,000. The Netherlands, with a tenth of Britain's population, builds proportionally more than either. The OECD Affordable Housing Database shows Britain's housing stock per thousand residents has barely moved since 1980. This isn't because the country forgot how to pour concrete, but because the people who vote control the people who permit. Political scientists have a name for what happens once homeownership crosses 50% of households in a democracy. They call it locked-in majorities. Once more than half the electorate owns property, those owners share a collective financial interest in restricting supply. They become the majority, they elect the politicians write the planning laws restrict supply, prices rise, and existing owners get richer. The cycle reinforces itself. The United States crossed that threshold in the 1950s, the United Kingdom in the 1970s, and Australia in the 1980s. In every case, in every country, housing affordability for new entrants begins deteriorating within a decade of that crossing point. It is not a coincidence. It is arithmetic. A British government commission in 1973, the Rotherham Commission on Land Use, explicitly noted in its findings that restricting residential development in desirable areas would enrich current landowners at the expense of future residents and recommended against it. The government read the report, then implemented the restrictions anyway. Because existing owners voted and future residents hadn't been born yet, you were excluded from a democratic decision about your own financial future before you were old enough to cast a vote. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. The Federal Reserve cut rates to near zero, and then the asset purchase programs began. The stated rationale was preventing a second Great Depression. The mechanism, however, was asset inflation. It was not subtle, and the people running it were not unaware of the effect. When a pension fund earns near 0% on government bonds, it hunts for yield. It moves into equities, corporate bonds, and real estate. Between 2010 and 2022, Institutional investors went from holding a negligible share of single-family residential properties in the United States to owning an estimated 3% of all homes nationally. That sounds small, but zoom in. In certain Atlanta zip codes, at the peak, institutional buyers were purchasing 1 in 5 homes. In Phoenix in 2021, 1 in 4 sales went to entities with no intention of living in them. This is not a conspiracy. It is rational capital allocation in a world where central banks deliberately destroyed returns on every other safe asset class. The Federal Reserve's own research papers from this period acknowledge what economists call the portfolio balance channel. The explicit goal of quantitative easing, QE, was to push investors out of safe assets into riskier ones. Housing was one of those riskier ones. The Fed knew. The Bank for International Settlements data shows the acceleration with brutal clarity. Global real house prices rose faster between 2020 and 2022 after the pandemic QE than at any point since their records began. This happened not in one country, but in every country simultaneously. That simultaneous global nature is the fingerprint. When the same thing happens everywhere at once, it isn't a local supply problem, it is global monetary conditions. There's a parallel from 14th century Florence worth examining. The Medici banking family pioneered an early form of cheap credit through letters of exchange, instruments that allowed merchant families to lend and borrow across Europe at favorable rates. Historians who have studied Florentine land registries from the 1380s to the 1420s document a striking compression in land ownership during exactly this period. Land moved from dispersed smallholders into the portfolios of merchant banking families and the church. The artisans who literally built Florence, the stonemasons, the glaziers, the carpenters, found themselves priced out of the city within a generation. Florence had no housing shortage, it had a credit problem. When money is cheap, it flows into fixed assets. Land doesn't grow. Prices rise until the builders sleep outside the walls they built. We repeated this in 2010 globally and simultaneously, with more computing power and less wisdom than the Medici. Federal Reserve data on U.S. household balance sheets shows the split clearly. Between 2007 and 2019, the top income quintile saw net worth grow by 60%, while the bottom quintile saw it shrink. The mechanism is straightforward. The top quintile owned homes before QE began, they owned equities, and they owned assets. The bottom quintile owned wages and bank balances. QE inflated assets. It did not inflate wages. The gap compounded every year at the rate of central bank policy. In October 1886, the New York City mayoral race featured 3 candidates: the Republican nominee, Abram Hewitt, backed by Tammany Hall, and a printer from Philadelphia named Henry George, running as a labor candidate who had just written the best-selling economics book in American history. George lost narrowly in a race many contemporaries believed was stolen by Tammany Hall's counting rooms. He finished ahead of a young Theodore Roosevelt. The result ended his political career and began the 70-year project of burying his ideas. George had watched San Francisco transform from a frontier outpost into a city within a single decade during the gold rush. What obsessed him was a paradox he could not explain away. As the city got wealthier, as wages rose and commerce expanded, the people at the bottom got poorer. Not relatively poor, but absolutely poor. New workers arrived, wages compressed, rents rose, and the men who owned the land on which the city happened to grow collected the difference. They had done nothing to produce that value. The workers built the streets, the merchants created commerce, and the community funded the schools. The landowner held the deed and collected the rising rent that all that community activity generated. His solution in Progress and Poverty, published in 1879, was a single tax on land values. Not on buildings, not on wages, and not on income from labor, just on the unearned appreciation of holding land. Because you can't hide land and you can't move it offshore, it sits there, known, unmovable, and taxable. The academic economics profession of the next 50 years, many of whose university chairs were endowed by landowning wealth, spent enormous energy developing theories that blurred the distinction between land and capital. They lumped land in with factories and machines and productive investment. They made it intellectually difficult to see that land was categorically different. Fixed in supply, rising in value entirely because of surrounding community activity, and conferring on its private owners a permanent, self-reinforcing toll on everyone else's economic life. But the evidence that George was right keeps surfacing. In Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew built a city-state from scratch and made a fundamental choice. The government would own 90% of the land and lease it back. The value that Singaporeans created together through schools, transit, and economic development would stay with the community rather than flowing to private landholders. The result is a 90% home ownership rate achieved through subsidized leasehold housing in one of the most expensive cities on earth. Prices are high, but they would be stratospheric under the Western freehold model. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, ran a quiet version of this experiment for decades in the 20th century. The city taxed land values heavily and buildings lightly, the inverse of most American municipalities. The result was that Pittsburgh had dramatically more construction activity than comparable Pennsylvania cities. When you tax land, land speculators stop sitting on empty lots waiting for values to rise. When you tax buildings lightly, developers build. The supply that housing advocates have been begging for appeared almost automatically when the incentive structure was corrected. The answer has been found multiple times in different countries in different centuries. It keeps getting buried because the people it threatens are the Democratic majority in every advanced economy. The very people whose votes politicians need are the people whose asset values the solution would moderate. The Ouroboros is complete. The people most harmed by housing costs are not consistently voting against them. They're aspiring to join the system. They're voting for their eventual mortgage, and the people who already hold that mortgage are voting to lock the gate behind them. There is a variable entering the housing equation that was not present in any historical parallels, and it is moving faster than any political system can respond. The Bank of England published research in 2024 estimating that between 30 and 40% of UK jobs are exposed to meaningful AI automation within a decade. IMF and OECD research finds similar figures globally. This creates a dual pressure on housing markets. On one side, if knowledge sector roles are substantially reduced by automation, the concentrated demand that props up prices in expensive cities weakens. San Francisco already experienced a genuine price correction between 2022 and 2024 tied to tech sector contraction. If AI accelerates that, premium cities face a structural demand shock. On the other side, AI dramatically concentrates gains at the ownership level. The equity holders of the platforms capture enormous wealth, which flows into real assets and land. This polarization produces a bifurcated market, a smaller, wealthier buyer class, and a larger, poorer renter class. The cruel irony is in the timing. Older homeowners who spent decades blocking development may find that AI-driven disruption collapses the wage-earning demand that was the foundation of their asset values. But by then, most will have sold and retired. The timing rewards those who arrive first and penalizes those who arrive into the aftermath. Housing is unaffordable not because of accidents, but because of deliberate systems, tax policy, planning law, monetary policy, and the mathematics of democratic property ownership. Tokyo is the one major global city that maintained affordability by stripping local governments of the power to block development, overriding the political will of existing homeowners. It required political force against the Democratic majority. Henry George found the diagnosis in 1879, but the establishment buried it. Singapore implemented a version of his solution, but virtually nobody copied the model. The Prop 13 template spread instead because homeowners vote, politicians count votes, and the system rewards those who understand it early. William the Conqueror knew that controlling land was controlling power. The Roman Senate restricted land redistribution because they were landowners. The East India Company's first act was to survey and title land. Every empire understood that the question underneath all other questions is who owns the ground. In most countries, the answer was settled long before you were born. The machine built to maintain that settlement is still running, and now you know how it works. If this breakdown of the hidden machinery governing our world has changed the way you look at the streets you walk on, please subscribe and like this video. We are digging up the history and the economic truths that have been buried for generations. Let's build a future based on understanding. Our next investigation into the forces that shape your life is coming soon.